This is James Cox of Silver Bullion. We have a special guest on the line. This is Professor Lawrence Kotlikoff. Professor Kotlikoff is the Professor of Economics at Boston University. He's also the author of The Clash of Generations. Professor Kotlikoff, it's a pleasure to have you on the line today.
Nice to be with you, James.
Lawrence, please could you explain very briefly your story, how you got involved in economics and how you became interested in unfunded liabilities?
Well, I was interested in economics because it seemed to be a very practical science. You could actually do something good for society potentially, or come up with some reforms to what the governments were up to. So when I was in grad school, I was doing work with a professor named Martin Feldstein, who was focused on national saving and economic policy, in particular Social Security policy. And then the whole issue of how Social Security was funded was introduced into my brain by Feldstein. And then I started working on that topic, and I started seeing all these different programs that seemed to be not paid for, that were promises that were just out there, that were unofficial, but they were still going to have to be paid for by somebody. But they weren't officially paid for in the sense that nobody had been designated to pay for them. And then I started thinking about how to try and account for them, and that led to working with Alan Auerbach and some other people on intergenerational accounting to really understand who's going to pay for what the government spends.
Okay, and just very briefly, you and I were discussing just the other day that there was also a moral and an ethical aspect to unfunded liabilities that go beyond simple economics that intrigue you.
For me personally, I think it's really immoral for us, for we adults right now, to be leaving, in any country, to be leaving massive bills to our children. Economists are supposed to stay above morality and their own opinions, but if you ask me what motivated me for getting into this line of work, it was partly some degree of outrage that we would leave such a situation to our children and grandchildren, that it just seemed unethical to be making decisions that were going to adversely affect them without giving them a chance to vote on it and giving them no say about it. So I've been looking at this degree of what I call generational expropriation and how it plays out in different ways over time in terms of the consumption levels of the current elderly and how they compare to those of younger people, and how that's affecting total national saving and investment and economic growth and real wages. So it's not just that we're leaving big bills for future generations to have to pay, but in our country, because of the size of our economy, we're affecting what we economists call the general equilibrium. So the path of the economy, that's how the economy is going to be situated in the future. And one of the implications of doing what we're doing is that we let older people consume a lot more. We tell younger people not to worry, and that doesn't reduce their savings so much, and therefore, or their consumption so much, and therefore we get more national consumption, less national saving, therefore less national investment, therefore less capital for workers to work with, therefore lower real wages for them to bring home. And we've seen in this country all those things happening in our country. We've seen extremely low saving rates materialize over time, going from about 15% of national income to now about 2% of national income. In the 1950s, it was early 1950s, it was around 15, 16%. Just so it's gradually gone downhill, investment's gone downhill, and real wages have stagnated compared to what we would have expected back then, back in 1950. So what you see in the simulation models of these policies is what you're actually seeing in the real world, I think.
Okay, that's fascinating. And just for our listeners who are unfamiliar with this topic, please could you briefly give an overview of what the national debts are for the USA, and then what are the unfunded liabilities with the official figures, and then third of all, the unfunded liabilities for the real figures?
Right. Well, the official debt in the hands of the public is around $13 trillion right now. So when the government borrows money formally and so takes money from you, James, and says, look, I'm going to give you this IOU, this government bond, treasury bill, then that's on the books. And then they take the money and they spend it, and it's clear to you and it's clear to them that they have to repay that borrowing with interest. Now, they may try and inflate it away by printing a lot of money and pay you back in watered down dollars, but at least it's an official obligation. But what if they take the money from you to spend, what they take from you taxes, and they say, don't worry, we're calling these taxes, but when you're older, we're going to pay you transfer payments in exchange for those taxes. So we'll take money from you now and call it, for example, Social Security contributions, and we will then pay you large Social Security benefits when you retire. So that obligation now becomes an unofficial obligation because of the words the government used. It's not anything really economic. It's just a matter of language. The government chose to call what it took from you taxes rather than borrowing. But in both cases, they're promising to make repayments in the future. One case, it's principal plus interest. Those are the words being used. In the other case, it's called Social Security benefits or health care benefits. Or it could also be promises to provide defense expenditure in the future to protect you and other people. So we have all these liabilities out there that are not officially recorded. They're off the books. They're, from Enron, we learned from that energy company that was engaged in fallacious accounting. We know that it's easy to cook books when you leave liabilities in the future off the books and make things look much better than they actually are. And that's what the U.S. government has been doing for decades, since really World War II. Enron certainly learned its accounting from Uncle Sam, not the other way around. So so we have now a fiscal gap. If you look at all the liabilities, the official ones, which are $13 trillion, the unofficial ones are massively larger. The total fiscal gap, the total difference between all the obligations, official and unofficial, that the government's facing, less all the future taxes that are available as projected to cover those obligations, is currently $210 trillion. So the official debt is $13 trillion. The true debt of the country is around $210 trillion. This is based on Congressional Budget Office projections that came out in July, called their alternative fiscal scenario. So anybody can take that CBO Excel file, download it.
Lawrence, could I just interrupt you very briefly, because that's not the number that I'm used to hearing when it comes to unfunded liabilities. The number that I'm used to hearing comes in at around 120 trillion. So maybe 10 times the debt, and still huge. But there seems to be a very large discrepancy between the 130 trillion or 120 trillion that we're used to hearing and this 210 trillion that you're saying is the actual figure. Please, could you expand on that?
Yeah. Sure. The 210, the 100 trillion or so is a figure assuming the economy ends in 75 years. It's the 75-year fiscal gap calculation that you're referencing. But There's nothing in economics that says we should look at 75 years into the future and then assume the government doesn't have bills at that point that have to be paid or taxes that will be collected. So there's nothing in economics that says don't look into the future beyond 75 years or go only out 50 years or go out 10 years. So economics is quite clear that you need to do what's called infinite horizon fiscal gap accounting. Now, because you're discounting future expenditures and future taxes, amounts that are way out in the future are going to have a very small weight, but they have a big enough weight in combination, all these numbers together after 75 years to produce the correct number at 210 trillion, not 100 trillion or 75 trillion or something like that. There's also this problem of labeling that how we, as I was referring to to how the government takes money from you, whether it calls it borrowing or taxes, that determines what gets put on the books. And under any finite horizon, the fiscal gap is going to be a function of the labeling. In other words, it's not going to be well defined. It's going to be a matter of what words the government uses. If it uses one set of words, it will produce a 75 or 100-year fiscal gap of one size. If it uses a different set of words, it'll produce, let's say, a 100-year fiscal gap of a different size. So any finite horizon fiscal gap is sensitive to the language, whereas the infinite horizon fiscal gap, which is what economic theory says to measure, which is the 210 trillion, that's invariant to the choice of labels, because you're not putting things off further into the future. You're always looking out into the future, as far as possible, out to the end of time, really, in terms of the mathematics, so that there's no way to get around having to incorporate every single expenditure that you're obligating yourself to.
Okay, sure. So in very simple terms then, the national debt is just gone over 18 trillion all in, which is terrifying. The unfunded liabilities, the official numbers are at about 130 trillion, but you're saying that unfunded liabilities, it's very simple. It's how many promises have you made? What is the value of those promises? And the figure, from the Excel sheets that you say are accessible is actually north of 200 trillion. Now, that is absolutely an incredible figure by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, James, let me be able to clear about these numbers.
Okay.
The 18 trillion in government debt that you're referencing is the gross debt. The Federal Reserve has been printing a lot of money and buying back that debt. So the debt in the hands of the public, which is really the relevant factor here, is 13 trillion, the official debt. So it's not 18 trillion. So first of all, we need to focus on 13 trillion. And then the 100 and some trillion in official debt, in the fiscal gap, is being done by somebody, being calculated by somebody who's not an economist.
Right.
Okay. So I have no idea where exactly that number came from. I know there are people like David Walker, who's a friend of mine, but he's an accountant. He was the Comptroller General of the Comptroller General of the U.S. That's the chief accountant for the U.S. He was the head of the GAO, the General Accountability Office, and he used to go out in his calculations. He still does out 75 years, and he says to me, "Look, Larry, 75 years is far enough for people to think about, but it's not far enough for economic theory." In other words, economic theory says that the numbers he's talking about when he gives his speeches about this problem, which are big, are still not the right numbers, because what numbers you end up with on a finite horizon basis depends on your choice of language. So the right number is really 210 trillion right now.
Sure. And also, it's perfectly reasonable for a baby born today. We've got to expect it will live more than 75 years, right? That's a reasonable expectation. And exactly. Near the end of that baby's life, it'll be needing the support it was promised. So, exactly. It's not just it's not just a terminology. It's factual, right? So, Lawrence,
it's realistic. And also, let me just say one other thing, which is that the entire economics profession, with the exception of some people on the extreme left and right, have endorsed this method of accounting. If you go to www.theinformact.org, THEINFORMACT.org, you will see a endorsement of a bill that is going through Congress now that requires the CBO to do infinite horizon fiscal gap accounting. And it's been endorsed by over 1,200 economists, including 17 Nobel Prize winners, and then the other, also people that are not professional economists, like George Shultz, the former Secretary of Treasury, and other former high-ranking government officials who have endorsed this bill. So you can't have the entire economics profession say to do infinite horizon fiscal gap accounting and then have an accountant tell you it should be 75 years and that's all. That
Sure.
just doesn't cut it.
That doesn't cut it. So, given that step one in solving this problem would be recognizing it and accounting for it properly, what other steps would be necessary in order to solve this problem? Because it's extremely serious.
Well, we have to do radical reforms of Social Security, the healthcare system, government expenditures on healthcare are about 10% of GDP right now in the U.S., and they're projected to rise to perhaps 20% of GDP, and that can't happen without bankrupting the country. So we need to get health expenditures under a budget by the government. So we also need to fix the tax system, which is a total mess in terms of just wildly complicated provisions that are unfair and also aren't generating enough revenue. And we also need to fix the financial system. So I have at www.thepurpleplans.org, thepurpleplans.org. Anybody can go there and see a set of proposals that I've come up with for how to fix each of these things. And each proposal is the length of a postcard. They're very, very simple solutions that anybody can understand, and they would get rid of our fiscal gap as well as provide us with the appropriate kinds of institutions that we need. Now, you're calling me from Singapore, right?
That's correct.
Singapore is very famous for having designed some fiscal policies and social insurance policies like your pension system that are much more rational than anything we're doing in the U.S. We have a social security system that has hundreds of thousands of rules when you really look carefully that nobody can really understand. It's about the most complicated animal that you could think of, or object you could think of in terms of people trying to figure out what benefits they're getting. So we need to simplify and get to reforms that actually make some economic sense and move in the direction of Singapore in terms of some of the policies that we're running.
Okay, so with that respect, the measures that need to be taken are relatively simple, but probably not so popular. So the next question would be, what are the chances of this being resolved in an amicable political manner, and what was the likely result of continuing along the path that we're currently continuing in the US?
So the chances that this will get resolved are really small, because the politicians from both parties are engaged in this game of putting more and more liabilities off the books. So the fiscal gap is growing because nobody's even paying interest on it. It grew by about $5 trillion last year. So I see no politician talking about this fiscal gap, no politician talking about the magnitude of the adjustment that we need, no politician suggesting fundamental Social Security reform, tax reform, healthcare reform. I know the president certainly put out a new healthcare bill plan for people that are uninsured, but we now have basically 4 government-run or largely paid for healthcare systems that are all running out of control in terms of their expenditures. We've got Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and then we also have the employer-based healthcare, which is also, in effect, a government-subsidized program because of the tax treatment of employer-paid premiums. So, and that's costing us tax revenue. So if you look at those 4 programs, they're a freight train to over a cliff. We're not having any, again, tax reform proposals that are serious. So I see the problem just getting worse, and the country, I believe, is already bankrupt, and we're going to have to face Judgment Day at some point. And it may be the way that some cancers grow, which are slow and they gradually kill you, or they could attack an organ and kill you very quickly. But this will kill the country, and it's going to lead I think, over time to much more money creation. We've already seen massive amounts of money creation by the Federal Reserve. I know that you're involved and interested in precious metals and the implications for U.S. fiscal policy on demand for those metals, but that certainly is connected to what kind of inflation the U.S. starts to run. If a country can't pay for its bills, then what it usually does is print money. And what we've seen in the last 7 years in our country is massive creation of money in order to pay for the government spending. Now, that's called quantitative easing, but it's really just been easing the burden of Congress for paying its bills. And I know now that Janet Yellen, the new Fed chairman, is moving in the opposite direction, reducing the printing of money. But when you have a country that's fiscally so far out of control, the pressure on the central bank over time becomes enormous, because there's just no other way to pay for the benefits to a 95-year-old if Congress won't enact higher taxes. So you see the tension here.
Sure. So just to try and put it in layman's terms, if the debt is easily understood, it's a debt that's been bought and sold. Unfunded liabilities are promises that are going to have to be turned into debts at some point in the future, and if there is no way to pay for those debts plus interest via regular normal taxation, that money's going to have to be printed. So
that's one way of putting it. Yeah.
Is that a simple explanation of how this process is most likely to work unless it's resolved?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Okay, sure. I mean, it's probably not helpful to become dwell too much on how this plays out socially, because obviously it's difficult to see how that much money printing could not upset the economy and therefore for society, which is not a good thing. In closing, then, Professor Kotlikoff, what systems would you like to see if you could start it all from scratch? If you could point to a country or to a particular model, what would you like to see in place that maybe America could aim for, or for emerging countries who are just trying to start their own system? What would you recommend?
Well, the Purple Social Security Plan that I have at thepurpleplans.org would require people to contribute to a personal account, and all the contributions would be invested jointly in a global market-weighted index fund. So it's a little bit different from the Singapore Provident Fund, but it's similar in the sense that there's actually investments being made. It's not that you take the money and just hand it to old people and engage in what I call as a take-as-you-go policy.
Sure.
So having a fully funded pension system, basically freezing the existing Social Security system and phasing it out, having everybody get a voucher for a basic healthcare policy that's not blue or green or red or platinum or silver, but the same basic policy, health insurance for everybody, and have the government provide a voucher that depends on your pre-existing condition, and make sure that those vouchers that can be used to buy basic health insurance policy for the year, that the cost of all those vouchers together do not exceed 10% of GDP. That's a very simple mechanism for getting a government provision of a basic health insurance plan for everybody without going broke. So you get rid of Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, employer-based health care in our country, and start from scratch and fix it right, and allow people to buy supplemental policies beyond the basic policy. On the tax system, I have different proposals for moving to I'd like to see the income tax and the corporate income tax transformed into a federal retail sales tax around 17%, make the payroll tax more progressive, and that could produce more revenue and really stimulate the economy. So there are things that can be done. On the financial system, I've written a book called Jimmy Stewart is Dead, which talks about moving to a full disclosure, equity-financed mutual fund banking system that would require, would prohibit the intermediaries from engaging in leverage and make sure that we never again have a banking crisis where any financial intermediary can ever go bankrupt. So I would welcome people to come to my website, which is kotlikoff.net, KOTLIKOFF.net. Take a look at what I've written, my columns, articles, books. Go to these websites, the purpleplans.org and the informact.org, and get involved in trying to focus the discussion by government officials down the right path. These problems are ubiquitous. They're not just American problems.
Sure.
Some countries have